What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Slow Restoration in the shop. Today we have a 2014 Chevy Silverado, and they took this for inspection and it did fail for lower ball joints. I checked it. It does. Obviously we have the wheels off already. It does have a little bit of play. It probably shouldn't have failed, but anyway, it did, and we're getting ready to replace them. So let's jump into it. A couple of things you want to remember or want to think about before you even start this job is, one, we took the dust shield off the end. You can get a skinny screwdriver and pry and just work your way around it. That pops off. It's just a press fit. The next thing is you will have to remove the axle, and part of removing the axle is taking this nut off. Now, this nut does set the preload on your wheel bearing, so you definitely need to put that back with the same torque. So make sure you have a way of retorquing that before you even get into it, because if you just run that on with the impact, you could be over torqued, under torqued, and either way it's not good for the wheel bearing. By the way, the torque spec for the axle nut or the wheel bearing preload, the axle nut, it's 188 foot-pounds. They do recommend putting a new nut on and not reusing the factory one, so keep that in mind. And so the reason we need to remove the wheel bearing, the reason we do need to remove the axle, is because here's the spindle. The ball joint comes down through, and there's not enough room to lift the ball joint up out of the spindle with that axle there. So in order to do that, we're gonna again take that dust cap off. We'll remove this axle nut off the axle, which will allow that axle to push through. And in the center here, we'll get some more light, there's 6 bolts that hold the axle to the stub shaft coming off the differential. So another thing to keep in mind before you do that, go ahead and mark that so you put that back in the same orientation. We'll just you can center punch 2 little marks or put a paint mark, however you want to do it. Just make sure the axle goes back in the same spot. So we'll go ahead and zip those bolts out, allow that axle to kind of droop down, take this nut off and slip that axle out. And these 6 bolts here, as you can see, you can pop that right loose, and we need to actually cut the wheel and work that axle out of this spindle. So we learned a little bit about doing the other side, so I'll show you how to do this side. The axle actually doesn't pull straight out like the older style. The older style, like I said, you take this axle nut off, take your 6 bolts off in the center there, and you can actually physically drop that axle down and slide it out. This one won't quite do it. So in order to do that, we unhooked the clip from our ABS line. We unbolted the brake line bracket off the upper A-arm. We took the upper ball joint loose, and I'm getting ready to go ahead and pop this caliper off. 1 bolt, 2 bolts. Take that caliper, set it up to the side there, which will allow this whole spindle here to pivot out, and we can pull the axle out fairly easy. You got to fight it a little bit, but fairly easily there. You actually don't even have to take it the whole way out. You can kind of leave it sit in that position, but we just need it out of the spindle there, the wheel bearing, so that we can get access to this ball joint. So let me go ahead and pull this off, get the axle slid out, and I'll show you what it looks like from there. We do have our pole jack to support this because it is pretty heavy. You have your rotor, you got your caliper, you got your mounting bracket, and this particular spindle is cast iron, so it is heavy and kind of awkward. I'll show you as we go along here. Obviously we have the caliper moved up. The pads will stay put pretty much. They have little retainers. We're all good with that. We did tap the center of that axle through a little bit, so you can see it's gapped there. Again, our pole jack is supporting this because right now there's nothing holding this up, and we do have our ABS line hooked to it and our tie rod. You don't need to disconnect your tie rod. You can if you want, and if you wanted to unplug your ABS line, you could actually take this and set it on the floor totally beside, but we're going to save a couple steps by just supporting this. And the axle, we were able to pull it down, go in between these little notches here, and as you can see, we're on the other side of that flange. So now we can finish taking and sliding that axle out. It'll definitely take two hands to do it because we'll need to pick up on this and support that a little bit. Once we get that totally out, like I said, we can kind of take the axle. Well, let me get that far and I'll show you again. And there we have it. Looks kind of awkward like that, but the pole jack supporting it, we have a bungee strap around, just holding that spindle so it doesn't fall off the jack stand. And like I said, if you wanted to disconnect your ABS sensor and your tie rod, you could literally set the whole thing to the side. But we have clear access to the ball joint now, and you can see that one's pretty floppy. It has some up and down movement, so we're gonna go ahead and change that. Let me show you how we're gonna chuck it up, and we are gonna use that ball joint press to do it. This ball joint does press down through. It's a little bit rusty there, so it's kind of hard to see where it separates, but this top part, the whole ball joint presses straight down through. So we have a collar here and a base. We're gonna put that on there. The ball joint sticks through the end of it. We have it chucked up, setting on our press here. There is a hole through the bottom of the press also, so we'll be able to take this whole assembly here and line it up over top of that ball joint. And we're going to want it chucked up pretty much like that. Like I said, the ball joint and the bolt, the stud is actually coming down through here. The top is actually going to press right on the top of the ball joint, and that's just going to shove that right through there. This collar will hold onto the bottom A-arm. We'll get the impact, run that down, and it'll drive that ball joint right out of that lower A-arm. So let's go ahead and see if it works. All right. As you can see now, it's popping right down through, and it just, there's a rust ridge there, just, you know, from years of driving in the salt and stuff like that, road debris. So let's go ahead, drive that right out. With that out and out of the way, we're just going to clean up this hole in the bottom of the A-arm. Here's our new ball joint. It does have some splines there, or knurling. We'll start it from the bottom. It's got a snap ring groove. You'll see what that's for in a second, but we'll start from the bottom, get that to stay put there, and we'll chuck up with the ball joint press, and we can actually press that right back in, kind of the same way we did, just opposite. So we'll flip the tool over and get something that presses here and has a hole at the top. Actually, I lied. We're not going to flip the tool over. We're just going to use it a different way. So this piece here actually goes on, and it presses right on the ball joint, right where it needs to, and obviously the stud sticks down through. Whoop, drop my ball joint. All right, so with that chucked up there, as you can see, the stud's going to stick down through the bottom of the tool here, just like before. This plate, or this spacer here, has a circle cut out, and it'll allow the ball joint to press up through. So now we can just tighten all that up and apply pressure, and it'll press that ball joint right in. With all that removed, as you can now see, the snap ring groove sits above the lower A-arm. We did get a snap ring with the kit, so we'll take our snap ring pliers, open that up, and there we have our snap ring installed. Ball joint is nice and seated in there. It's locked in with that snap ring. We'll go ahead and pop this plug out. It does include a grease fitting, 90-degree grease fitting we can screw in there. Sometimes it is easier to leave these out and put them in later, even though it's harder to start them later. But the axle is pretty tight. But when you're done with this, then you'll have a greasable, kind of upgraded lower ball joint. So you can definitely keep maintenance a little bit better by greasing that lower ball joint and extending the life of it. All right, now all we got to do is put it all back together. I usually like to take the ball joint and kind of pull it out towards you. It'll help get that positioned in there. And what we're actually going to do is go ahead and unbungee this spindle. We'll flip this around, make sure everything's clean here. And we're actually going to slip this spindle on the lower ball joint that we just replaced. We'll run our nut on there a few threads to hold it in place, and that'll allow, once that's on there, this assembly here to pivot out, and then we can get our axle slid back in. And there we have this whole assembly. Like I said, put on the lower ball joint, couple threads. You can let it droop down. That helps a little bit. Be sure you don't pinch or pull on your wires or lines or anything. So now we can actually take and feed this axle back through the wheel bearing, through there, get the spline started, get it back up in position, and line up our flange and our axle, get those bolts started, finish pushing this up, get the axle to finish feeding through, and go ahead and attach our upper ball joint. We got everything pretty much put back together here. We have our axle slid back in. This nut is snugged up right now. We do have to torque that yet. Caliper's back on, so let me show you a quick little trick here. A lot of times, especially on the stock ones, the ball joint will just spin when you try to tighten it up. As you can see by there, just spinning. So if we take and grab a pry bar and just simply pry down onto that taper there, put some pressure on it, and if we spin that, it'll grab and allow us to tighten that up. And once that nut gets tight a little bit and starts putting pressure on it by itself, it will tighten up. Usually no issues at all. And with all that done, we did go ahead and torque our axle nut. Again, they do recommend using a new nut. 188 foot-pounds, and if you need help, you can always take a small rod, start the truck up, run the power seat back, put the rod in between the brake pedal, jog the seat up just so it puts pressure on the braking system, and that will hold it in place so you can go ahead and torque that. We'll put these dust caps back on, and we're ready to put the wheels on. Of course, we did grease everything too. Those new lower ball joints needed grease in them, even though they're new. And our outer tie rods, we went ahead and greased them also. So everything's tight. Go ahead and recheck everything, make sure everything's the way it should be, nothing's binding, and everything's tight. And that's lower ball joints in a 2014 Chevy Silverado.